In this video, I'm going to walk you through the process that I used to create this illustration. How do we go from A to B, from thumbnail to finished image, and understand how all the steps in between add up to an image that has some illustrative quality? For this one, I used a combo of Procreate on an iPad Pro and Photoshop for adding some final touches and last little details. The character here is actually one I designed quite a while ago for one of my fantasy comic books, Ara. And I'm also going to tackle and use a concept I've touched on recently on the channel, which is how good are simple, almost symmetrical compositions, especially when you want to create something that has a lot of impact and vibrancy in a pretty easy, basic way. Understanding how to build your own reliable process is, I think, one of the best ways to both enjoy the process and act of creating art more, because you can relax knowing what comes after this step. Like, where are you in the process? But it's also something where once you take care of that, once you figure out a reliable way of making art, it allows you to much better learn and explore with concepts such as composition, or to improve your color theory or drawing. Again, from my experience, process unlocks a huge amount of creative potential and makes making art a lot more fun. So hopefully that sounds interesting. Hopefully you'll join me. Let's jump in and get started. Alright, welcome to the Drawing Codex. My name is Tim McBurney. I've been a professional working artist for over 20 years, and on this channel, we're all about drawing cool stuff from our imagination, embracing the challenge of drawing, and mastering the craft of line and color illustration. Now, if you'd like to learn more about line and color illustration, the same style that I create all my comics and illustrations in, you can check out my free Quick Start Guide. It's aimed to get you up and running quickly in Photoshop, developing your own simple, reliable line and color process. It's free. The link will be in the description. Go check it out. Okay, just a quick note before we jump into this. This is the first time I've really tried a process walkthrough video, so let me know how this goes for you. This is not going to be a 4-hour, obviously, fully narrated real-time tutorial, but I wanted to share some of the things that I've been doing recently, which is trying to use my iPad more for drawing and trying to figure out how I could incorporate it into my professional workflow. So I kind of been practicing chipping away at images, kind of half an hour here, 10 minutes here, and seeing how much I can get done. So that's part of the process that I'm going to share with you, starting in Procreate and ending in Photoshop, and seeing how much I can fit in. But definitely this is something where I'm still going to be creating those kind of long, epic 4-5 hour tutorials where we go through this in real time, fully narrated. But here, again, this should be a good opportunity for me to sit back a little bit, talk to you about the process and the ideas and the concepts that are often in the background as I'm kind of struggling my way through an image. So again, let me know how this one goes. What we're going to start with, though, is the idea. So this is the image that I ended up with, and my goal here was actually pretty similar to what you see. I wanted to leverage and try out one of the things I've been talking about recently on the channel, which is creating and using a very simple, centered, symmetrical, formal style of composition where we just sort of place the subject, the main object, the character in this case, in the middle of the frame. And then I just had this idea that's very similar to kind of what you can see there, where we have some rock framing either side. And I thought this would just create a very simple image plan that was kind of, honestly, like hard to mess it up, right? Because we have a character who's fairly dark against a lighter background. We have some great graphic shapes. And this also was a way to create a lot of impact and sort of strength to what is like a fairly kind of soft character. So that was basically the idea here. Now, I'll talk you through some of the other aspects of the character. This is kind of a little bit interesting to look at the original character design. So this is the original kind of Sen character design from Ara, the fantasy comic that I created. And I also wanted to see whether or not I could redraw her. Almost from memory, I did actually check out this reference, but I was sort of trying to just draw it as I would today and see what would happen. And I think it's interesting where, you know, this was done in 2008, and this is almost like 20 years later, really. And I still feel like this original design I did has a lot of charm and appeal. And I think the character, there's something to that character, which is always, it's interesting to note how often you can just capture magic in a bottle with a character a little bit, where you kind of feel like that's the character I want. And it really doesn't matter how much better you get at drawing it's often like the better you get at drawing, that the worse you kind of draw the character. And there's always just something to that sort of core level of charm, which I often find is key to character design. It's often a matter of just finding that magical illustration that really kind of just encapsulates the character. So that was kind of the goal, as well as, I haven't actually drawn that character for quite a while. And I also did have somewhat in mind to revisit a little bit of this blue, right? The blue that I used on the Ara cover. So I kind of had this idea, right? I was like, you've got the mountains, they can be blue, the character can be warm. So a lot of what you're seeing there was actually part of that original plan. But let's take a look at the concept of process, and I'll walk you through how often I'm thinking of the different steps that I'm creating. And these are also things that I'm often teaching. If you take the Line and Color Academy course, where we sort of talk a lot about developing a simple, reliable process, a detailed, reliable process, and how you can kind of create something that becomes very relaxing to work with, where you kind of know what's coming from one step to another, but also how we can sort of combine and make a process either really complicated and have a million little steps, or we can just keep it really simple. So this is a bit of an interesting one, and I want to walk you through and talk you through kind of what I was planning in my head in terms of the steps that I was going to take. Okay, so here we go. This is some diagrams about process, which for me helps me to explain what's sort of going on in my head and how we often sort of teach the different steps to a simple line and color process. But again, this may feel like it's maybe complicating this too much, but trust me, again, once we sort of start rolling with this, you kind of understand how these different things fit into each other. So normally with a line and color process, a comic book style process, we have a thumbnail sketch or an idea, and you may do one or multiple, like 10, 20, 100. With this type of process, though, often actually what I'm doing is I'm sort of just doing one drawing, right? We're just starting and going, and this, even though I'm trying to get a fairly polished finish to it, to me, I really do view this as sort of almost like a sketch process. Like this is an exploration, and if this image fails, or this idea that I had in the beginning kind of craters, right? If that all kind of goes down in a ball of flame, that's okay, right? Because there is an experimental aspect to this. If this was a professional job where like the result had to be perfect, this is where I would do more thumbnails, more ideas. I'd really sort of go and make sure I found exactly the right one, that would work, etc. And after that, I would do the construction drawing and then polish lines. You can think of this as your pencil phase and then your inking phase. And then we sort of do flat color and often some rendering. Again, sometimes a lot of rendering, sometimes not much rendering at all. And then often the finishing touches, which is where I add extra contrast, brightness, color adjust, etc. What I'm doing here, and this is a good example of how, like, for instance, if you wanted to make this, if you were starting out and you wanted to say, I want to work on my anatomy, I really am not finding that I can just go from a rough sketch to like finished fancy lines. This is where you would sort of expand this construction phase, right? So we'd sort of almost have like multiple, right? You'd almost sort of have like multiple versions of this, right? Where, right, you'd kind of have like 3 or 4 construction phases on top of each other, where you'd kind of start with maybe the bones, the skeleton, the proportion, then you'd add muscles, you'd be able to refine. And this gives you the flexibility to kind of chill here, iterate, and know that like, hey, you can keep making mistakes and it's totally fine. But with this type of process that I'm showing you here, basically I'm combining the thumbnail and the construction drawing sort of into one. And I'm basically taking that leap of faith that comes from a lot of experience drawing. But also these polished lines kind of aren't that polished, right? If we were sort of to be, sort of clear about it, right? These are maybe kind of sort of polished lines, right? These are kind of, like if they're a little bit rough, that's okay. If they're a little bit sketchy, that's okay. If I have to erase, if you see, even if there's some construction in there, it's okay. So again, a lot of the way that you develop a process is based on how much time you want to spend and the finish that you know you need to get. And again, when you take the pressure off and you're not creating a polished cover for a professional environment, again, it's kind of easy to maybe wing it a little bit more. Now, the other thing that I'm doing, because Procreate tends to lend itself less to using a million layers and the selection tools aren't that good, what I do is I kind of combine the flat color and the rendering, and I don't try and separate everything out into a million layers. I basically treat it as if I am painting with watercolor or something, where I kind of just do a mix of just painting with sort of flat colors, flat shapes, and I think about it very simply, but I'm not trying to leverage the layers too much. I'm kind of really thinking about just sort of painting each element basically. And after that, we kind of export it to Photoshop and add the finishing touches. So that's basically the process that I am using. Now let's again look at kind of how that turned out in Photoshop, looking at that final illustration. So this is the image that actually ended up coming out of Procreate, and basically it's all there. I just needed to add those final touches and add some contrast, brightness, tweak things a little bit. And the reason that, like, sometimes at the end of me working in Procreate on the iPad, I'm able to get it to a pretty good level and the contrast is sort of right. Sometimes though, I just kind of leave it to Photoshop because I know I'll be able to wrangle the layers a little bit better and sort of tweak things and just sort of get it working there. So often I don't worry, this looks a little bit sort of washed out, it's not quite there. But I don't worry too much because I know Photoshop will be able to kind of save me and it has the tool. So that's where I sort of deal with the final grade. This was the finished lines, and really the thumbnailing and sketch process was just a matter of sort of getting to this point. And a lot of the rendering that I did is kind of interesting because we started with some line and color, but I actually added quite a bit of quasi painting to this image to kind of get it to work. And this is just one of these things where I didn't really have a strong idea of what I was going to do, what it would look like. I was just kind of playing around, experimenting. A big part of what I believe is to just pick some really simple tools. So this is just one brush. It's like the syrup brush in Procreate. And I am also using the Sepia Lines technique that I've sort of covered previously on the channel. There's a couple of recent videos going over how I sort of set that up. And you can sort of see that sort of working, giving us that sort of interesting gradient. And what you see in the final is that that also gives us some really interesting final color vibration. And what I'll probably do is add to the quick start guide that I've sort of got that goes over Photoshop technique, but I will add, probably by the time I sort of put this up, I'll add the pencil brush that I use here, which is really simple, and also the other sort of brushes I use in Procreate. But it's really basic. I just use the syrup brush. That's all I'm using for sort of doing the painting. And I'm just kind of trying to make it work and keep things really basic and graphic. But let's take a look first at what that kind of initial sketch and construction phase looked like. Because everything here is a matter of understanding, what do I need to do in order to get to the lines? Like, how much detail do you need to add in order to get to the stage where you're ready to go with your line work? That really is the only question. And for a lot of us, that means you need to do 5 passes of the construction phase because you need really high polish. Or it may mean you can just do a really rough sketch and kind of go for it because you're just kind of sketching, you're going to add some color. But again, it's not a matter of creating the most polished illustration. It's all a matter of, with the thumbnail and construction phase, to set up a plan for an image and then also figure out how much detail do you need to add, what do you need to construct, how much work do you need to do in order to start putting down finished lines. Okay, so I start with a not tiny thumbnail, but still a fairly sort of small, controllable size to create this drawing at. And I am doing a little bit of construction here. You can see that I'm thinking about what goes underneath the cloak. I'm constructing and thinking about the pose and the gesture. This is actually very similar to the original character design pose that I created. Not trying to break the mold in terms of creating something super dynamic. Just trying to get the essence of the character there. So the way I've sort of started is to say this all relies on basically making the character interesting and engaging. They don't need to be dynamic, but they need to have some mystique about them and embody the character that, you know, defines their character. And this is all a matter of just refining that drawing and sort of figuring out the pose and the gesture and where the costume goes and remembering those little details. And you can see that I've already sort of put in this general idea that, like, look, I'm going to have some pillars here, but at this point, I don't really know how big the character is going to be in the frame. I don't know exactly what's going to go around them. I'm just starting with, like, can I find a good pose? And once I sort of do that, you can see I'm actually using an interesting technique here where I kind of build out all the stuff around. And you can see it's actually filling up the page, but I'm still not. You can see at this point, this is the point at which I really said, okay, now that I've built this out, I actually think I like this. I don't need to zoom up and make the character really big. I can keep them pretty small. what I've done is kind of just taken that, adjusted it, sort of composed it within the frame, and then I've also like added quite a bit of other paraphernalia there. And really at this stage, what I'm trying to do is deal with some of the leading lines that are going to make a major impact on the composition. So with a rock, you often have striations within the rock because it's based on sediment kind of building up. So often rock has sort of lines that relate to the horizon line or to gravity, and you can use those to direct the eye in the same way you could lines on a building or any sort of man-made structure, because they relate to gravity because they're based on sedimentation. So basically I'm sort of designing where those lines will go. I'm trying to create some interesting overlap here. So I have like, you're sort of looking at sort of different rock faces overlapping each other. And I'm going to try and use that to create depth. And also these leading lines you can see here, boom, boom, right? All these, I'm trying to design those. I'm also trying to think about, as I create one chunk of rock that is in front of another, what is the silhouette going to be like? So I'm trying to create an interesting silhouette. I'm trying to line that up with those sort of almost perspective lines of the sort of rock striation. And at the bottom, I'm trying to think about what is an interesting arrangement of rocks in the foreground, right? So thinking about what's overlapping what. And the way I like to frame this, where I've always tried to talk about the way that we're telling a story. And what we're doing here is telling the story of depth. How do I use multiple rocks and multiple things to tell the story of depth in the foreground and make that sort of compelling and interesting? So you can see I've sort of added a little bit of stuff there. I've added, and even at this stage, you can see I've added some indication in the sketch of like where these little plants will go, right? Again, very sort of barren, stick-like sort of plants. And for some reason, the recording sort of skipped a bunch of stuff, but that's kind of what I need. I just need a rough idea of like what's going to go where. And I've had enough experience that I feel like I can kind of start to do the finished lines. But there is some awkwardness to these lines. You know, the way the cloth falls, there's a lot of these things where like, I know I could do a better job if I really sorted that out. It's not 100% accurate, but these are things that hopefully no one will really notice. So first step is really just see if I can nail the character. And often when I'm doing this, I am actually kind of in my mind saying, if I can nail the character, then that's fine, we're good. Like if I know I can do that, I know the rest will probably work out. If the character's not working, this is maybe where I'll actually go back and start refining that construction drawing until I know it's kind of working. So once I've done the character, I'm actually separating this out into 3 distinct sets of layers, which again seems like it may be complicated. In Procreate, it's a little bit complicated to manage all the layers, but it's basically repeating the same basic idea. And I've got everything that is sort of in front of her, sort of in front of her foot, more or less, is in the foreground. She is on a separate layer, and just a couple of things behind her are on a separate layer as well. So really here, all I'm doing is just kind of roughing in where all these different shapes are going to go, these different rocks, but I'm trying to define a top, a side to these rocks to allow me to kind of add some two-tone shading to them. And again, at this point, I don't really know how much painting I'm going to do with the background or what's going to happen or whether it's going to work. I'm just going to sort of wing it and see what happens. Now, this phase here, I think, is really important. It's often something that we skip over. Now, I've kind of done an initial tracing, essentially, of that construction drawing, and I've kind of figured out where all the lines are, but it's only when you often take away the sketch that you see what you've got. And it is important to say, what can I do to plus? Like, go around and sort of fiddle, like finesse, tweak the face, make sure good enough detail in there, make things a little bit darker, you know, close off all the lines, just kind of clean it all up. I often think this is like 10 or 15 minutes that can often make a huge difference to, again, a fairly sketchy, rough kind of illustration, having that extra level of polish. It's often knowing where to add those last little bits of detail with the line work that will mean something that's pretty rough will have that extra feeling of sort of illustrative quality. So you can see I'm just going through, right, refining, deleting a few bits and pieces. And here, I'm just doing some initial flats. And I'm just doing this with the syrup brush in Procreate, just kind of tracing the outlines and doing the thing where you drag the color in, although that doesn't always 100% fill things. Here I just took that reference, that original image, and you know, I just kind of filled in the colors from that sort of reference because I was like, that's easy. It does mean that it's a little bit more yellow than it maybe should be, but we can grade that back. So here's where you're seeing a lot of the preparation that I kind of did that's often not clear when I'm sort of doing it in line, is that we're often imagining with a clean line style what is actually going to be there, and I'm sort of drawing the outlines for it. But you can see here we have these large shapes being created now and these interesting silhouettes on the edge that are created by me just kind of drawing those weird lines. But I'm sort of planning that in the beginning, and the way I would do that is, again, the more you want to get good at that stuff, you would kind of do a tonal layout as part of your thumbnail process. So if you're starting out and you're struggling to think conceptually about the depth and telling the story of depth, is you would probably add a little, again, 10 or 15 minute step in between where you do your sketch and your construction, and then you kind of figure out in your mind what are those different big shapes that are overlapping each other, and you may want to plan out some of these major two-tone shapes that are being created. At the moment, again, because I've been doing this for so long, I'm kind of winging it, which is, again, something that you can do as you have a lot of experience. And, I did this also when it was, when I was sort of figuring these things out, but, I have a lot more success with this now that I've drawn, hundreds and hundreds of and thousands of rocks right over the years. You kind of get a feel for how it's going to work. And this is why it's so important to build up visual library for these things. So here what I'm doing is again, trying to get that core idea of like two pillars on the left and right and one sort of pillar of light down the middle. We kind of lose the greenness on the bottom, but I did want it to be this kind of light shaft, right, going up the middle. And I'm playing with that here with bright blue in the background. And here I'm sort of adding some extra green. And all I'm doing is just using, it's just baked. That's it. That's the only sort of mark I'm making. And I'm trying to think about abstraction and just creating shapes. I'm still just using the syrup brush. And I think using that simple brush gives everything a very sort of coherent look. So here I decided, and I thought, look, maybe I'm not going to be able to get away with just doing two-tone stuff here. I haven't had a lot of rendering or shading to those rocks with the line work. So I'm kind of doing a mix here of like, it's not 100% flat color with the background. It's a little bit more. There actually ends up being about 4 tones I use. But I'm trying to keep this graphic. I'm really thinking about this as distinct shapes of one color or another. There's no blending. There's no edge control. There's no painting, there's no gradients within there. It's just flat shapes. And I think also there is an abstract nature to that where it's not just that I'm trying to define realistic form. I'm really trying to make interesting graphic shapes. And a lot of this is design. It's less form and drawing and rendering. A lot of it is literal graphic design, like a bit here, a bit there. You're just kind of going on gut, right? Which again is not necessarily the best thing to do, but this is where, again, a lot of sort of intuition and thinking abstractly can help. Looking at your Mondrians, your Jackson Pollock painting and understanding the nature of abstraction. What is just going to look good, even if you turn the painting upside down. Here, again, I've decided, I'm like, look, there's really not enough contrast in the foreground. So I'm adding some extra kind of darker green tones there to see whether, that'll kind of work. But you can still see, again, if you look here at this down in the corner, you can see this is very rough. Like these are playful strokes. I'm not trying to say, hey, this face of the rock is green. I'm just kind of putting these marks in there, and that gives it a sense of complexity and texture that is faked. It's an abstraction, right? It's kind of like cross-hatching. So that's kind of what came out of Procreate is this sort of image. And I think this kind of worked pretty well, but it's obviously not what you're seeing here. So let's take a look at the different steps that I used to create that polish. So at this point, I kind of finished the color and pretty much all of the rendering. All you're going to see next is me just messing around with the final grade. Okay, so we can see here the image that came out of Procreate. And this, as I sort of touched on, is a little bit grayed out, but I don't mind that because I know Photoshop is going to be able to kind of deal with a lot of that contrast. So you can see here there's a lot of texture, there's a lot of grain that I've sort of added, and that really is the sort of final touch. So if we take that off, and then we also take off this final grade, what you're seeing there is something like pretty similar. I think what I did is sort of increase the values that were on either side. You can see here that I have that layer as well from Procreate. And I think I basically just sort of darkened that up and made that even a bit more extreme. But you can see here, you know, zooming up, looking at the kind of mess, right? This sort of abstract mess, you can see that it's not meant to be clean, but that I think gives it a bit of more of a sketchy sort of quality and makes it work. What I've done is just darken those down. I just made a selection based on the sort of flat colors that I have and added that sort of tonality. And what I'm doing is just sort of making a few other tweaks. What I did is I plussed and added even more of that kind of orange. So I just sort of hit the character with a really sort of bright, vibrant sort of orange. I think this would be an overlay, and that just adds like a lot of extreme, right? So if we sort of take that off, that would be the sort of original, right? Boom. Then we sort of get that. And I think here, again, there was also a bit of orange. So I'm really sort of highlighting and bringing out that character. You can see I've also pushed back and really sort of made the background very sort of vibrant and blue. And that's basically all I'm doing there. The next few sort of things that I'm really sort of playing around with, if I can sort of find, yeah, here we go, the right sort of grade layers. If we kind of take some of them off or all of them off, right? What I've done is darken everything. Then I have made the character even more saturated. Then I have made the background even more saturated. And the way I'm doing this is just with masks that are isolating different elements of the image, right? So if I take off those masks, you can see that that's kind of just making everything blue. If we put a mask on there, it's just selecting that. And the same thing here, right? If I take that off, it's making everything that color, but this mask is just selecting that. Then I've got a bit of texture. And this is a real sort of fine grain texture that still is using the pencil tool in Photoshop. So it has a really sort of graphic look. And my goal here is to make sure everything is graphic, right? No painting, no smudginess. I don't want this to feel like a painted background, but I'm also adding a few really graphic sort of, you know, feeling of sort of stuff floating in the air. Then I'm going to actually bring the saturation down just a bit. It's very hard to see these things, but these often make the difference. And then I'm bringing up the levels. So I don't want it to be day glow at the end. But again, I do want it to be pretty vibrant. And then I'm doing something interesting. I'm basically adding two gradients. I'm adding a warm gradient at the bottom because warm comes forward. I want the character to come forward, but also everything on the bottom of the frame is in the foreground, just because that's how this image is kind of designed. And everything mostly in the background. Again, these things back here aren't really, you know, in the background, they're in the foreground. But if I just run a blue kind of overlay gradient over the top, or I think this one might, yeah, it's overlay. So again, that just kind of gives it a very sort of two-tone gradient, and I find that kind of works pretty well. Next, I'm just going to make everything slightly more sort of greeny blue. I'm going to then add some levels, but I'm just sort of making the masks, so those kind of really just darken down the bottom there. And then again, I'm going to brighten everything up. So we're just kind of pushing and pulling the image, and then the last thing I do is add some green, some texture. These are things where I just drag it over. Same with the logo, and boom, right? You know, there we go. And that really is, again, the process. I would say the Photoshop sort of tweaking process is maybe half an hour, sort of 20 minutes. It's like pretty quick. And I find that, you know, doing all these little things often takes, again, what is like a fairly sort of sketchy thing, but I've got the sepia lines working for me. That adds a little bit of texture. I got some paper texture. I got some noise. I got these other little bits of texture where now all this kind of nonsense down here, it kind of feels like it sort of has a bit more coherency and logic to it. And again, I'm just able, through a couple of little dirty tricks, bit of experience, to kind of make something that's like, doesn't really have any right to have this level of illustrative quality to it. But because we design a really simple plan and we're able to execute on that, and we're just using simple things like warm colors come forward, cool colors recede, right? I'm making the background really blue. I'm making the key primary read really orange and bright, and boom, you know, everything kind of turns out pretty well. So I was pretty happy with the way this thing turned out. All right, so that's pretty much all we got time for here. If we take a sort of quick look at the finish, you can see that, again, I feel like this sort of turned out pretty well. I think it has a nice sort of level of finish. To me, again, a lot of the lines are very sort of simple. A lot of the drawing is very simple, but when you kind of add up a lot of really basic techniques, I find that often you can get, as I said, a pretty sort of sophisticated look at the end. So this is often just a matter of understanding your process, of making sure you have a reliable process so you can sort of step through it. And I've really enjoyed this process of trying to learn how to use the iPad a little bit more, Procreate a little bit more. So yeah, let me know whether there's been a few tips here that sort of helped you. The key here I find that's so important to understand is the more reliable your process, the easier it is to play around and explore and try these ideas. Like I said, where I'm like, I want to try just creating a simple centralized composition. The more reliable your process, the more you know where you are in it, the easier it is to just kind of chip away at something, play around, have fun. And that's something that I found has helped me a huge amount. Now, if you want to see a much more detailed, real-time, fully narrated version of this, check out this tutorial, the first bit of which covers the color theory and creating a simple color plan, and that follows on into a multi-part tutorial where we talk about all of the different sort of steps that I've talked about in much more detail. So if you haven't already, check that one out.